Mbali, welcome to Education International, the family of teachers from early childhood to higher education. As we celebrate, we are very grateful that you have been able to join us as an anchor and as a host now. Can you take over? Thank you.
Grateful for this opportunity. Now, we are commemorating World Teachers' Day today. And of course, as we do so at a very different time in our lives. We know that we are battling the coronavirus, and we have to now learn ways to live alongside this virus. Now, before I get straight into it, Mr. Maluleka has, of course, introduced me. I am a journalist in South Africa. I'm a TV reporter for 24-hour news channel. And we will be in conversation then with Professor Steve, who has conducted the survey during a very precarious time in our lives as we are in the midst of this pandemic. Now, we also will be taking questions, so you will be listening very closely on into what went into the survey that Professor Steve will be sharing with us. Now, we know that this COVID-19 has affected a number of countries. It has affected the world over when it comes to issues around how we live. And it has affected issues around the economy. It has affected issues around jobs. There's been major job losses because of COVID-19. And another sector that has also been affected is, of course, the education sector. And this is where now we'll be bringing in Professor Steve. He has conducted the survey in which he will be telling us in terms of, how teaching and learning was conducted, especially during the lockdown regulations, where we found a number of countries and the world over introducing these lockdown regulations, which meant that teaching and learning could not take place in the traditional way. Professor Steve, thank you so much for joining us now. You have conducted the survey. Your survey is titled COVID-19 and Education, How Education Unions in Africa are Responding to the Pandemic. If you can just share with us what went into conducting your survey.
Thank you, Mbali. The survey was actually a follow-up of what had earlier been done by Education International at the global level, because in March, at the outbreak of the pandemic, at the global level, Education International had carried out a survey to know how the unions are responding and the situation of the education system, students, teachers, and education support personnel. So the study that was initiated by Education International Africa region, which we conducted in August and September, was actually a follow-up and to deepen that earlier study to know what the situation had been within the Africa region. The survey covered 54 unions across 34 countries, and we relied basically on structured online questionnaires, and also complemented the study with interview of 13 union leaders from 13 countries across Africa. Virtually all regions of Africa were covered in the study. And so we look closely at the situation of schools at the outbreak of the COVID, whether they are closed or open. We looked at the processes of resumption. We looked at initiatives by government to sustain learning during the pandemic. We looked at also what unions were doing in order to minimize the impact on teaching and learning and on their members. We looked at the impact of the pandemic on the condition of teachers, their terms of service and salaries, and a number of issues that we are covered. And interestingly, we found out a number of issues that align with the fears that the general public had. For instance, schools were shut in all 34 countries. Only about 8% said schools were open or fully open. And where they are open, in most cases, they were for special category of students. And so learning actually stopped. And the pandemic is unprecedented. I think there's nothing like it since the end of the World War. And the world didn't see it coming. The impact is profound. And the impact will still be studied for a long time to come. Now, when learning came to a halt, um, state government, national government took some steps to ensure continuity. About 80% of those surveyed said that governments initiated teaching and learning through radio and television programs. Again, we know this is not an effective means of teaching and learning because it's one way, and sometimes they are pre-recorded. So there is no feedback mechanism, no assessment. And again, it's assessed only by a few learners who live in urban areas and who had electricity, who had radio and television. We had about 50-something% that said there was online learning, mostly for tertiary institutions. Again, such teaching and learning could have been accessed by only the rich who could afford computer, electricity, internet. So we could say that learning significantly was halted and there wasn't quite much achieved. The teachers and education support personnel on their own part were rudely shocked because they were not prepared for what came their way. UNESCO Institute for Statistics has statistics that show that majority of teachers in Africa, even where they are qualified, had not been adequately trained to use educational technologies. And so teachers did not have the computers, internet, electricity, infrastructure, and the psychological orientation to go online. So it was a period of frustration for them as there was that big gulf between them and their students. Again, there were cases of infections. We had 4,000 and above infections of teachers in South Africa, though in many other countries there was that view that the health data of those infected were not released. So they couldn't know the exact number, but most countries feared that teachers and students were also having infections. And in fact, in terms of reopened schools, the Minister of Education for State in Nigeria gave the figure 15% as emanating from schools that reopened, 15% of entire COVID infections in certain countries as coming from the school environment. So there was that issue of infection. The condition of service of teachers were also devastated, largely for those in private schools. They were either laid off, their salaries delayed, or not paid at all. And in places like Rwanda, government provided loans so that proprietors could continue to pay these teachers. During my interview, we found out that even the proprietors did not, in their good number, access those loans. Possibly they were not sure of being able to pay back. So those that suffered most were teachers in private schools. And in the public sector, though they received their salaries in the majority, but those in temporary employment in the public sector were also affected. Either their contracts were terminated or they were not immediately paid. Overall, the impact of the COVID is a fear that inequalities will, get bigger. Education inequalities between the rich and the poor, between the marginalized and those who have access, because you now see people living in the rural area, you see the girl child, you see those with disabilities, you see those from poor homes. So at the end of this COVID, it could be possible that the educational inequality we try to close up in Africa had actually widened. And this is a cause for concern because the global measure of educational attainment over the century, over the decades, from education for all to Millennium Development Goal and now education 2030 has always placed the Africa region, especially sub-Saharan Africa, at the bottom of achievements. And so this calls for concern that government and Education International have to address issues of education inequality at the end of COVID. And we are not sure that all those that left school could come back. because we've been battling with out-of-school children. In Nigeria, we have close to 12 million out-of-school children. That's the country with the highest number of out-of-school children in the continent. And based on the population of 200 anyway, 200 million people, and we know there are also other countries with that higher rate, but this is likely to increase. And so there is need for programs to be initiated to ensure that after COVID, students that left schools might come back. And let me also mention one very important negative impact that has to do with school feeding, because many students are so poor that the only meals they used to take are the school feeding, the meals provided by the schools. With the closure of schools, these students went back to their slums or rural areas, and they could not access the feeding again. So hunger, malnutrition, disease, and apart from lack of access to education, could have been the lot of the preponderance of students, knowing that majority of the dwellers in Africa are in the rural areas and are actually lacking. So the overall impact of the COVID has been quite devastating.
Thank you, Professor. You've named a number of issues in which education has been affected, especially during the pandemic. Now, I just want us to zoom into the issue specifically, because you've mentioned the issues around how teachers had not prepared for this, how governments had not planned for this, and how when it came to teaching and learning, it had to be done differently. And everybody was going into this very blindly. When you zoom into the impact on education, if you could just take us through that and just let us know how, in general, has education been affected by the pandemic?
Yeah, as I stated earlier, the pandemic led to closure of schools. The study showed that only 8% of unions surveyed said schools were fully open, and 15% said actually those schools that were open were tertiary institutions, possibly private schools, because many public, even tertiary institutions, had issues with providing all the protocols required, so they could not open. In terms of reopening of schools, which started with around August and September, we discovered that countries began to phase their reopening of schools, starting with what is now known as exit classes or examination classes, those that have to write their school or ordinary level school certificate. And eventually, by this time, many more schools are opening. So the schools are not even totally open as we speak across the country. I did say in specific figures, 87% of those surveyed said their countries used radio and television to reach students. And we have explained the deficiency in using radio and television, particularly science and mathematics teachers. We are concerned that you could not teach mathematics and science, which were practical courses, through television, which were and radio, which are, one-way communication. Now 32% of those surveyed said students were reached through take-home workbooks and packages, which enabled them to be working, alone at home. And 55% said online means were used, and which we said these are for the privileged few and tertiary institutions. And of course, you have 21% that said no action was even taken in their own case. So that closure of school was very effective. We also know that we asked the unions to say how effective overall teaching and learning had been during the closure. 83% said learning was ineffective. So it was as good as saying no learning actually took place, because there was no supervision, no serious interaction, no assessment, and you couldn't be sure it covered the syllabus. And we also asked the union their feelings about introduction of educational technology or going online. Do they have any fear that it could affect the future of their career? 60% said yes, they are afraid there will be job losses if the online is implemented. But 34% agreed with the statement that, yes, educational technology will make their job easier. And then 36% said there's need to shift online. 26% said there's no effect. So overall, majority of those surveyed are afraid that even the advocacy for online education may affect their jobs. And now, in terms of government support, 62% of those surveyed said government rendered no support whatsoever. So the union and the educators were left, to be on their own and so forth. Yeah.
And Professor Steve, you've mentioned issues around how, when it comes to support, that teachers found themselves vulnerable. Also, when you're looking at, in terms of training, that not much training was done to prepare teachers for online classes. I want us to move now to another question that I have for you. I just want to find out from you, specifically looking at the pandemic, and specifically looking at teachers and education support personnel across the region. How did you find that in your study?
The impact on the education support personnel and teachers, like I said earlier, the teachers that were in private schools, majority of them had their jobs stopped, had no salaries paid, or were laid off. And we had cases where they could have the proprietors could have borrowed to pay from government, but they did not access. And actually, majority of the teachers in public sector had no issue because government was able to sustain their salary. That we proved. But the number of those that were in temporary employment and contracts that were affected was significant because they couldn't keep their contract or keep their pay. So the impact on salaries and condition of service was, quite significant in this respect.
Then looking at teacher unions and looking at educators across the region, how did they respond to the pandemic? Because we know that teaching and learning could not be done in the traditional way. So when you look at how the teacher unions responded, as well as the educators across the region, how did they respond to the virus, and was it effective?
The unions actually, I think, did what they could do at best within the context. 92% of them indicated that they created awareness and sensitization of their members about COVID and how to stay safe and to address issues about teaching and learning. So 92%, which is like virtually every union, was intensively engaged in addressing sensitization and awareness issues about members. Another 72% said they engage in social policy dialogue with government. That means they try to engage the government. I do believe maybe your next question will come about consultation and how the extent the government was able to listen to the unions. So, but for now, 72% said they engage in social policy dialogue with government. 38% said they developed tools and instruments that could help their members to cope and that could also help, especially with reopening of schools, to know exactly what to do. There were other actions taken by the unions. For instance, in South Africa, they were able to win what they called free data concession. The government and the public teamed up with the unions to ensure that the communication companies gave them free access to educational portals, so that for students and teachers to visit educational portals, it has to be free without charging them for internet, because we know that bandwidth cost is very high. In Gabon, they have free electricity and water, and so they made efforts. In Kenya, the university's academic staff took the government to court when they wanted to cut their salaries, and they won. In Zimbabwe, they also took court action. So unions, uneven reactions, but there were countries that were on top of their game. Again, back to South Africa, they were able to sign what they called comorbidity agreement, which enabled teachers above 60 years or those with underlying ill health because the WHO had already said that people with underlying ill health are prone to COVID infection. So they signed an agreement that this category of teachers could teach from home with special arrangements. So a number of these measures had gone on, across the country in different fashions.
And looking at the societal problems and looking at social impact of COVID-19, when you look at school closures and distance learning, during the pandemic, what has the social impact of school closures and long distance learning been like in the midst of COVID-19?
The social impact is great because if you look at it from societal point of view and sociologically speaking, there is increased inequality. There is increased educational inequality. And if education is at the bottom or foundation of development, that means there is widened gap now in terms of development between the powerful and the powerless, between the haves and the have not. That's a fundamental thing that we have to grasp with, knowing that education defines development. So with this inequality that has occurred, because some had access to online education, continued their learning without problem, whereas majority did not have, then obviously there was that social inequality. I've mentioned the issue of hunger and malnutrition, which is key and social in Africa. That school feeding program, which has become even a UN agenda, and in most countries, an agenda as well, developmental agenda, was also disrupted. And so we could have seen many children go without feeding and hunger and malnutrition, and that would predispose them to disease and so forth. So the impact is really serious. And then we look at the girl child and gender and violence, gender-based violence has increased this time from South Africa to Nigeria to Ethiopia. Check the social media, the rage of social violence, gender-based, during this closure is unprecedented. And social media has helped a lot to expose most of this social violence, and security agencies are going after them. So these are all impacts of COVID, because the school traditionally has the function of playing the role of a custody. When the schools are in session and working properly, they take custody of these children. The gender issue is addressed, custody of little children and all that, and they wouldn't be exposed to such violence. I discussed with some people during the interview, and they said rape has increased in their countries, and many children are wondering. And where the economy has been open and the schools closed, then the children are even left without the care of their parents equally. They have left the care of the schools. They also leave the care of their parents, because their parents, when the economy was reopened, also had to go to work in order to fend for them, because you know that the shutdown in the economy was affecting the economies of the families. So from different angles, violence, inequality, gender issues, feeding, hunger, and poverty. And I keep mentioning that Africa, sub-regional, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, hasn't earned the mark it's supposed to have when global educational performances are assessed. So these are all helping to really whittle down the great strides that had been made before the pandemic.
Now, Professor, we also find ourselves in a situation where many countries are beginning to ease down the lockdown regulations, and we are beginning to see teaching and learning and pupils and students going back into the classroom. Now, when you look at the findings of your survey, would you say that have governments in the region put in place adequate measures to ensure that teaching and learning now, even though we still find ourselves in the midst of the coronavirus, happens in a safe environment?
Yes, we asked the leaders to tell us, assess on a scale of 1 to 5, point by point, what is the score for face mask, the provision of face masks in their schools, provision of water and sanitation for washing of hands, provision of personal protective equipment for teachers and students, and then the possibility of social distancing within the classroom and outside the classroom, and the provision of every school with the health guidelines and overall ability to meet the WHO guidelines. We ask the leaders to assess their countries on these issues. On the average, 3 is what we got. On the average, majority, the average is 3. That means on a scale of 1 to 5, most countries have performed just moderately, which means that there's still room for improvement. And surprisingly, there are those that score their country 1, which stood very inadequate. And some score their countries 2, which meant inadequate. So the majority lie between being moderate and sliding towards inadequate. And so it is important as schools resume that countries should put in place these protocols, because as I mentioned earlier, even the Minister of State for Education in Nigeria has given a figure that we're still looking at, that 15% of total infections are coming from school environments. And that has been the reason. If you also look at the survey we did, we asked the leaders if they prefer schools to resume now, no matter the situation, or they would prefer schools to resume in future when COVID is under control. 53%, 53 said they preferred schools to resume now. And the lesser number, slightly lesser number said in future. So among the unions themselves, it is 50-50. Half want schools closed still, and half felt they could resume, provided these protocols are made. So resumption of schools must be done with cautious optimism. So
right.
as to
Just the last question from me.
Yeah, thank you.
Just the last question from me. We don't have much time. I just want to find out if you can just take us through quickly through the recommendations you have made in your survey, specifically to government and to teacher unions, should we find ourselves in another crisis of this nature.
Yes, quickly, for Education International, the research has revealed a lot, and it already has resources. So they should pool the resources revealed by the research and existing resources and use this time to share best practices among the unions in order to strengthen them. Number two, Education International should collaborate with government and other international organizations to use this time to review existing guidelines for education in emergencies, because the guidelines exist, but COVID has shown that there could be such impact that will take everyone unaware. So the time to review existing emergency guidelines is now. I should also mention that African Union, which is the continent we are looking at, has come out with its own framework for dealing with COVID, which is called DOTSS. The full detail is in the report. Now, the findings have almost 100% complemented every aspect of the DOT framework of the African Union. So we are calling for synergy between Education International and African Union so that they could increase the momentum and impact. And for governments generally, we discovered that 62% or more didn't get support from government during this time. And even about more than 62% said government did not consult them or did not use their views. So we have two recommendations for governments. They need to consult these unions at this time, because teachers have a right to be consulted in matters of education. It's a right. And then in terms of support, teachers need social psychological support, professional development, and professional preparation in terms of shifting to online. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Of course, that is Professor Steve there. He conducted the survey called COVID-19 and Education, how education unions in Africa are responding to the pandemic. Unfortunately, we don't have much time to respond to your questions, but I'm sure if you do write those questions on the social media pages, I'm sure Professor Steve will be able to answer those very crucial questions. Thank you very much. It's back to you, Mr. Maluleke.